Hi, and welcome back to Enigmatic Universe. I am Clifton3D, and today we are getting into the next video of Monster Madness October. And we're going to be jumping in to one of literature's greatest vampire women. This is an article that I actually wanted to read on Saturday during my live stream, but we didn't get to it, which it doesn't really matter because we're getting to it now. It is definitely something I wanted to talk about. The story of Carmilla. Literature's first vampire was actually a woman. Surprisingly, because most people actually think that the first vampire was Dracula. I certainly thought so, but this is also news to me. And of course, when we're having this Monster Madness October, we will be getting articles that are probably a little bit older and not from 2023, but that doesn't matter. The novel Dracula, written by Bram Stoker and published in 1897, became a cult classic of horror literature throughout the world. It brought vampire legends to a wider audience and captivated readers of all ages. It also opened the door for murky, obscure tales of vampires and other mythical creatures that had previously been poorly documented, ushering a new age of horror and the paranormal. However, Dracula is unjustly cited as the first ever vampire novel. In truth, that honor should go to the novel Carmilla, written by the famed Irish horror writer Sheridan Le Fanu and published in 1872, roughly 26 years before Dracula. The story of the lesbian vampiress Carmilla was something thoroughly new and exciting in European literature, and its publication cemented Le Fanu's career. But what is the historic background of the novel? Did the writer find inspiration in real, documented vampire cases? This, of course, being Vlad Dracula. The two iconic works, Carmilla and Dracula. Today, one cannot bring up the stories of vampires and horror literature without someone bringing up Dracula almost instantly. Bram Stoker's eerie and unsettling work of horror fiction truly paved the way for the genre, but it has much to thank Carmilla for. Written 26 years previously, this story of a lesbian vampiress served as a clear inspiration to Bram Stoker. The latter author found inspiration in the novel by Sheridan Le Fanu and chose a historic ruler, the famed Vlad Dracula of Valachai, and the eponymous vampire count. Somewhat unjustly, Dracula took over and rose to fame, leaving Carmilla somewhat underappreciated. Still, the two stories, although sharing the same concepts, are quite different from each other. Carmilla was revolutionary in so many ways. Stylistically, it is a classic representation of the Gothic literature that was prevailing at the time in terms of the horror genre and the setting. Carmilla is a classic. It is centered within a gloomy and eerie castle. A mysterious ambience prevails, and a supernatural, enigmatic being is the centerpiece. but other aspects within the novel were truly pioneering. Notably, the story revolves around a female vampire, the eponymous Carmilla, who is romantically attached to its victim, a young female protagonist, Laura. The story clearly involves themes of paranormal seduction and lesbianism, which were quite unheard of in the Victorian era. Through this story, Sheridan Le Fanu was attempting to dispel the negative perception of lesbianism at the time by portraying the mutual and irresistible attraction between the two ladies of the story, Laura and Carmilla. Or was he just a pervert who wanted to see two women going at it? Following the publication of the novel, numerous ladies felt a connection to these characters, finding in them a symbol of many Victorian-era women who were judged, restrained, and misunderstood. A novel with bold topics. Of course, another important aspect of Le Fanu's story is the independence of women and strong female protagonists.
Let me tell you something. You women from the 60s really messed up my life goals. You didn't want to stay at home and clean the house, take care of the kids, have dinner ready for your husbands when they got home from work. That is all I want to do. But no, you thought everyone wanted to be independent. I don't want to be independent. So now here I am, going to school, because I'm ready to go to college and get them a job and education. Women.
This setting worked towards dismissing the aged Victorian perspective of women being mere possessions of men who relied on the men for guardianship and leadership. What is more, the story portrays the male characters as somewhat opposite of what the ideal Victorian-era man. They are helpless, counterproductive, and clueless. Well, that sounds like modern Hollywood. So this whole concept doesn't seem all that new, does it? Throughout most of the story, women are portrayed as equals of men, which was a huge step forward for the period. Nevertheless, themes of lesbianism were by far the most radical in the novel. The vampiress Carmilla is sexually attracted to the young lady Laura, and the latter somewhat shares these sentiments. Through Laura, Le Fanu explores the concept of same-sex attraction, as the character is indecisive and questions her sexual orientation, being both attracted and repulsed by the female vampire. The following excerpt from the novel perfectly describes her confused state of mind. I experienced a strange, tumultuous excitement that was pleasurable, ever and anon mingled with a vague sense of fear and disgust. I was conscious of a love growing into adoration and also of abhorrence. It is likely that Carmilla did not receive the same fame as Dracula because of its unique literary themes and unorthodox topics and theories. If published 25 years later, Carmilla could have received the accolades it deserved. Dracula, which was a more classic horror fiction narrative, gained the favor of the audience and is still widely translated and published anew well over a century after its initial release. Of Dracula, we know enough. The author took a historical figure and gave it the abilities of a vampire. The void of Valhalla, the so-called impaler, Vlad Dracula, was the 3 times ruler of this European medieval polity, and was, of course, in no way a vampire. Today, considered a national hero of Romania, Vlad Dracula is well known as a capable ruler and military commander with a penchant for impaling on stakes the Ottoman Turk prisoners of war. This somewhat bloody and macabre medieval method of execution gave Vlad Dracula a fearsome representation and ultimately led to Bram Stoker choosing this historic figure for his fiction, Bloodthirsty Vampire. Is there a historic background to Carmilla? But what about Sheridan Le Fanu? Where did he find inspiration for the vampire story of Carmilla? Scholars agree that the writer likely consulted the written works of Dom Antoni Augustin Calmet, particularly his 1764 work Disastrations sur les apparitions des Angers des... I'm not going to even continue to try to read that because I'm butchering it, which translates as dissertations on the appreciations of angels, of demons and spirits, on revenants or vampires of Hungary, Bohemia, Moravia, and Cilicia. So there you have it. This was one of the earliest scholarly works dealing with vampires and vampirism, exploring the topic in detail and presenting various theories on the matter. Dom Calmet wrote some 20 years after some of the first meticulously documented vampire cases and helped spread the popularity of the vampire as a novelty subject. Don Calmet, when writing about vampires, explores some of the popular and contemporary cases. These include the 1726 case of the Serbian vampire Arna Palve and the 1732 case of the vampire in Hungary. Definitely, I think we should check those out at some point. These cases were arguably the first to bring to term the wider European audience. The word vampire itself is a Serbian word of Slavic origin and was borrowed into Hungarian and Austrian, and finally English. And true to this, almost all the early cases of vampires were documented in Serbia, where even today there is a widespread belief in the existence of vampires, especially in rural communities. In 1726, Austrian authorities investigated a possible case of vampirism. It was connected with a deceased Hadruk brigand freedom fighter leader, one Arnott Pavel. I don't know if I pronounced these names correctly, who perished in 1726 and reportedly returned to haunt his relatives and the inhabitants of his village. At the time, vampirism was a commonplace occurrence and belief in ritual in rural Serbia, where numerous pre-Christians, early medieval, heathen superstitions and beliefs were still kept very much alive. Like in all stories involving Serbian vampires, the deceased person returns to life shortly after burial and quite vividly haunts the relatives. The person either asks for food, water, or clothing, pesters the living, and supposedly curses them, making them ill, and finally causes their death. The grim and eerie accounts of Serbian vampires. Arnott's case was thoroughly documented by the leading Austrian officials and physicians at the time, which led to the stories of vampires being introduced to the European public. Much to their fright and sensation, the people from the deceased man's village reported that he came back to haunt them. They spoke of the deceased man in detail, saying that during his lifetime, he had himself been harassed by a vampire. He got rid of it by eating the soil from the vampire's grave and smearing himself with his blood. However, less than a year after the man died by accident, numerous villagers reported haunts and illnesses, all attributed to the vampire. By January of 1726, Austrians reported that 17 people perished to the illness. The case only got weirder in the following months. People claimed that the village woman The first victim of the vampire Anat had once eaten the flesh of dead sheep that were killed by this vampire, and had also smeared herself with vampire's blood. This supposedly continued the streak of vampirism in the village. The Austrian authorities then witnessed the villagers exhuming the body of the vampire Anat, whereupon they saw that his veins were repleted with fluid blood, and that fresh blood had flowed from his eyes, nose, mouth, and ears. That the shirt, the covering, and the coffin were completely bloody. That the old nails on his hands and feet, along with the skin, had fallen off, and that new ones had grown. His body was red. His hair, nails, and beard had all grown again. Seeing this, the people drove a wooden stake through his heart, whereupon the cadaver reacted by letting out a frightening, blood-curdling shriek, bleeding profusely and groaning as if alive. They then beheaded the corpse, burnt it, and put an end to the vampire's streak of haunting once and for all. It is possible that Sheridan Le Fanu read these detailed descriptions made by the Austrian officials and used them within his Carmilla story. Notable aspects of the story of Anat that share a similarity with Le Fanu's work were that of a young teenage girl from the village. Austrian reports tale of a young 20-year-old girl that was in perfect health, but suddenly awoke in the middle of the night, sweaty and trembling, uttering shrieks and full of fear. She reported that a vampire visited her at night, trying to strangle her. The incident repeated in the following nights, and the girl was dead 3 days later. From Serbian Slavic mythology to the pages of Carmilla and Dracula, a similar case was reported in 1725, also in Serbia, where a man called Petar Plagojevic returned as a vampire to haunt his village and family, causing several deaths in a short amount of time. The Austrian officials witnessed his excommunication as well. Upon disinterment, the cadaver was perfectly preserved, with freshly grown nails, hair, and beard, flowing blood in veins, and blood in the mouth. The villagers staked it, seeing blood flowing profusely from the orifices, after which they beheaded and burnt it, ending the plague. These two stories were published to a wide audience, leading to the famed vampire craze that spread throughout Europe, ultimately serving as a source of inspiration for horror fiction authors such as Bram Stoker and Sheridan Le Fanu. Still, if we observe the possible inspirations from literary sources, we can see that Sheridan Le Fanu could have been inspired by his preceding colleagues. One of the first female vampire characters in fiction preceded Carmilla by roughly 70 years. In Robert Southey's 1801 epic poem called Talaba the Destroyer, the main protagonist faces the vampire of his deceased wife, Onaza. After his wife dies, her body returns to haunt him in the form of a vampire. Talaba manages to kill it. In fact, it is in this epic poem that a long list of annotations lets us know in detail the historic aspects of vampires. Robert Southey clearly cites Don Cummey's 1746 dissertation on the apparition of angels, preceding the writing of Carmilla by many years. Still, his epic poem was not well received and was largely obscure in its time. A pioneer of early horror fiction, In the end, we might never know from whence did Sheridan Le Fanu draw his vampire inspiration. Undoubtedly, by the time he began writing Carmilla, information on the mysterious Balkan vampires of Serbia were readily available, and the enigmatic events that transpired in those villages were already transformed into deeds of fiction and legend. Nevertheless, Carmilla undoubtedly moved boundaries and is a bold, groundbreaking, and iconic work of early horror fiction. A very interesting article indeed. Carmilla is certainly an interesting character. I didn't realize that she was lesbian. I've heard about Carmilla the vampire before, but never in this context. It's definitely interesting learning more about that. I'm not too happy about the connection to modern day Hollywood and pop culture, but there it just goes to show you that this is not a modern concept. Weirdos have been around, perverts have been around forever. And look, hey, I'm a guy, you know? Seeing two women make out is not really that big of a problem for me. But it doesn't need to be in fiction. It doesn't need to be in Hollywood, or it doesn't have to be again and again and again and again and again. It doesn't have to hit you upon the head. That's my only issue with that. However, of course, it is part of the story. That's what it is. I've definitely enjoyed reading this article. I want to look into more of Carmilla. I might even see if I can find an English version of Carmilla and read it, enjoy it. And I'm also interested in looking into those two vampire accounts that were clearly documented by Austrian authorities. Be interesting to see if I could perhaps even read it in the original language, as I can read German. But German that old might just be beyond my capabilities. Anyway, that being said, I really enjoyed it. Let me know down in the comments below what you think of this story, of this topic, and let me know if this started off good with the Monster Madness October, or if you think that I chose a poor topic. Anyway, if you like this video, smash that like button, consider subscribing and hitting the bell for notifications. Thank you, and take care.